Hi everyone. Day 5 at the Candidates Tournament in Moskva is in the books, and we have our first of things to happen. Unfortunately, it's not the most exciting of first, that being that all 4 games were drawn, not a single decisive result, but that doesn't mean we're not going to learn something in this video and that we're not going to have fun recapping the games. We're going to start right there at the top, where former world champion Vishy Anand took on the American Hikaru Nakamura in a opening that represented a first for Hikaru, a many times repeated for Vishy Anand, but that didn't really change things, and that Vishy really wasn't able to get a lot out of the opening with white. It's interesting sometimes when you think about the fact, what did these players prepare versus what they actually got? But Hikaru played a Berlin, and after 4d3, we're right in a non-territory, right? This is his backyard pretty much, and after bishop c5 castles, maybe we'll get the same type of line we've seen before, but not anymore, not when Hikaru plays knight to d4. Now, I did some research here, and it seems that Hikaru has never actually played this line before. Was he trying to repeat a game previously played by Kramnik against Anand, with that game going c3? That's just from a couple months ago at the Zurich Chess Challenge, where Kramnik and Vishy played this position. But Vishy decides he's not even going to give Hikaru a chance to show that he might have an improvement over that game. Again, that would have gone with c3, bishop b6, knight a3, with the idea being, of course, a natural thing that the pawn on c3 maintains flexibility and the chance to get more space, which is why black strikes with an early d5. And it's fun to see a position where we have an imbalance immediately, black having the bishop pair, and but to go with it, he has the double pawns and a potentially open king. Again, this was the game between Vishy and Kramnik from the Zurich Chess Challenge. But as we said, Anand was not interested in seeing whether or not Hikaru had an improvement, and instead went immediately for the more solid move, knight to d2. And after a6, bishop a4, b5, we see some very natural moves, and our first critical point, at least as far as the teaching moments I'm going to try to get across here, starts with d6. The thing about this position is it's really instructive for amateurs to notice that, yes, all we've done is see pieces develop. They develop towards the center. White's already castled, and nothing really spectacular has already happened. But it's important to understand that you have to grow out of the mindset of, let me just get developed and get castled before starting and choosing a plan. And without the move d6, black is potentially worse very quickly in this opening. The reason is that white has a threat here. It's a small positional one, but it's a threat. That move is a4. The plan is that if I get a4, I'm threatening to take it because the pawn is pinned to your rook. You have a few bad choices. Either you take me, leaving the a6 pawn isolated. You push it, which, to give an example, if castles a4, b4 had happened, you push to avoid the trade. Now white has the nice positional strike with a5 separating the two pawns and creating potential targets for the rest of the middle game. Or you might even have to play something really bad and defensive like c6, which is just slow and closed, leaves your pieces cramped, and who's your uncle, right? We don't want that kind of thing. And if I take here, you're going to have to take with the c-pawn, which also separates the pawn islands, which is a grouping of pawns. So I really found that instructive, and I'm learning a lot from diving into these games and seeing why did the players play what they did at the early stages. And you can do the same if you search the game, see what was played previously by players of their level, and try to really understand why the move orders were chosen. And that's exactly why Hikaru plays d6, because this move opens up the c8, g4 diagonal, and therefore prepares to meet a4 with a trick. Bishop to b6, and then bishop g4 with tempo, hitting the queen and defending the rook so that now I can take back on b5. You could argue that black has already not only completely equalized, but has just as many dynamic winning chances as white does here because of the accuracy in the opening. Black has the a-file. White doesn't have anything structurally to point at, right? It's not like you look at this position and notice double pawns for one side or an isolated pawn. Everything is totally equal. And that's why it makes sense that after h3, bishop e6, Hikaru was willing to take on something a little more dynamic to create those chances. Hikaru's in a little bit more of a position of a need to win if you consider the overall standings of the candidates. Now, at first I looked at this position, and I admit that when I joined it live at 6 a.m. Pacific time, I thought that maybe knight to g5 was a good move for white, and I'm thinking, isn't white going to start getting the initiative? Aren't these double pawns a bad idea? Hikaru, what's wrong with you? Don't do this to me, man. But then I realized that h6 is actually totally fine, and white might even get his own knight trapped if he's not careful. So because of that, knight h2 makes sense by Vishy, and you can already see the writing on the wall. The goal is very clear. He wants to put the knight on g4 and just simplify pieces even further. And because of that, I wasn't really thinking that we would get any more than the equal result we had. Some interesting things happened, though, so let's pay attention because it is still a little instructive. After castles, knight g4, queen e8 was played by Hikaru. He said and admitted that probably just taking on g4 and then queen to a2, guarding the e6 pawn, is even more simple and maybe gives him better counterplay long term. I also agreed and was hoping to see something like queen a2 just because I wanted that race position where one side might win. What do I mean by a race position? Well, instead of taking g4, queen a2 immediately was also possible, and a line that might happen after takes and then g3 followed by some pawn moves. You might see a position where black is committing fully to the queen side with a bind, while white has chances with moves like g4 here. Maybe I get g5, maybe I open up black's king, maybe I checkmate him. I don't really think that's going to happen, but I think that both sides have something to play for here. So it's funny that in order to sometimes get these dynamic games, both sides have to cooperate, right? And here, it just didn't seem like the riskiness was going to be played. No one was interested in biscuits. Maybe they're not into Bisquick. Maybe somebody should have gotten the Betty Crocker brand instead, or maybe that little guy that goes, woohoo, when you poke his belly, right? Maybe then they would have risked it to get the biscuit. You get what I'm saying. Unfortunately, those were not the things that were going to happen. Hikaru just played queen e8, and after bishop e3, guess what we're going to get? More trades, and then even more trades with the knight coming to g4. I criticized d4 at first for Hikaru, thinking, aren't you creating long-term weaknesses? But then I realized that the d4 pawn preventing white from really dealing with the c2 weakness was kind of critical. The main thing being that if white has a chance to play c3 and then knight g4 and trade off, white's going to get just as much pressure against these pawns long-term without black having the same counterplay. So d4 was important by Hikaru. And I think this position was pretty much just a draw already. It was noted in the post-game analysis that rook a1 was the best move here for Anand, mainly with the point that black can't immediately challenge him with rook a8. Why? Because after takes and g5, suddenly the king side gives access to the white queen, and black can't quite generate enough counterplay. Here's what happens. Queen a1, we get some trades and some checks, and eventually white's pawns are going to end up being a little more mobile, a little more valuable, especially with the check on f5 followed by picking up with tempo. That guards d3, which puts black's counterplay at a stop. So because of that, which Hikaru said he saw, he said that on rook a1, he had prepared the idea king h7. It makes sense because not only now does g5 not come with a threat, I'm guarding h6, right? But also now rook a8 is an idea because we're no longer worried about those lines. Simplification will likely happen. You know what they say, simplification killed the cat. So because of that, I think we would have still seen the draw, but rook a1 was not chosen. Instead, g5 immediately was by Vishy. After hg takes, we saw the big trade. Black wins some pawns, so does white, and then Hikaru decides to just settle for the draw, kind of because he has no choice. Blocking with the rook on e6 on f7 is not going to change the scenario that we're getting a perpetual, so why pin your own rook? So where does that leave us? In this game, we had the former world champion unable to get anything with white. Doesn't help Hikaru's chances overall, really, as far as the candidate standings. He's still toward the bottom of the pack, but take away that big blunder against Karjakin, he hasn't really played a bad chess game in the entire event. And so with that, we move on to our next affair, which was between Aronian and Karjakin. Aronian and Caruana, which was a fun game with an opening that we don't see very often between these two players. Let's jump right into that. Now both the preparation into this game and everybody who was just paying mild attention to what was going on revealed that Fabiano Caruana has never actually played the Benoni, and he made comments that said, I've been trying to play the Benoni for a long time, but nobody's ever let me. And of course then Aronian responded naturally, you can play the Benoni against me anytime, my friend. To which I then said, I could make so many awkward jokes about the tension in this relationship, I'm just going to leave it for the spectators to think about what those might be. But anyway, what we had here was a Benoni, pretty typical stuff, and if anyone wants to play the Benoni against me, they're also invited to, because who doesn't like playing a clearly better position as white? All jokes aside about the Benoni, let's continue and get to a position where why was Karjakin interested in the Benoni? He had an idea. This is a theoretically known position where black has played g5 previously. Maybe that seems to overextend the king side to you, but the point is that I guard f4, therefore preventing white's common break, and I create some potential leaping pads to the king side for an attack. But Karjakin had a new idea. He played the positionally challenging bishop g4. In a position where you have less space, typically minor piece trades favor you. Black obviously has less space in a Benoni, so if I can eliminate my light square bishops, I free up a few more squares for the knights to wrestle over, and I maybe open up more squares here on d3 and c4. When you think about common tactical patterns that occur in the Benoni, you know that the c4 pawn break is something that white has to keep their eye on. So bishop g4 makes sense. It's because of that actually Alexandra Kostyniuk, former women's world champion, suggested that maybe white should say no thank you and wave that Dikembe Mutombo finger with f3. The problem is that if black just backs up, white doesn't have a clear plan either here. Aronian said that after bishop b2, knight h5, g3, he didn't really think that black's position was really that bad, and which is why he didn't go for it. And I can hardly blame him. As I said in the analysis, even a simple move like rook c8, is f4 really a threat? At first you think double attack, that sounds like fun. But no more double mint gum is going to be had by white after knight g4. There's threats like bishop to d4 check, knight to e3. Yes, there can be some weird things that happen, like knight to d1, bishop d4 check. I spent some time looking at it with the lizard. This isn't just superficial conversation, despite the humor. But I think in all seriousness, I think black does get some open lines, and also even in this position, if black isn't really interested in the all-out gambit of bishop d4 check, I think even positions where sometimes the knight is taken on h5 aren't the worst thing in the world. But we're not going to get into that because it didn't actually happen. Instead, after bishop to g4, Aronian decided to allow it, and he played the move. Bishop takes g4, and after knight f takes g4, bishop to b2, a6, we get our first critical moment where maybe Fabiano had something a little bit better. Which, it's surprising that if c4 turns out to be the critical crux of whether or not this line in the Benoni works for black, if he prepared it, why didn't he go for it? The move c4 is a tactical shot that, again, is a common pattern that occurs in these positions, because what black is often getting for the sacrifice pawn are open diagonals to the king. Remember, that pawn was on c5 the move before, right? Black is getting squares. And if there's other tactics that can occur on the c-file, black usually gets the compensation he's looking for. It's kind of weird because it is a very much Benko gambit type compensation. It's not exactly concrete. After takes rook c8, black even has to make a retreating move with knight f6, but the long-term effects show that c4 is not that easy to guard. In fact, if the knight moves, we're going to end up getting a tactic with b5, which eventually takes advantage of the pin on the queen. A few more moves show that the line might end up giving black exactly what he needs with moves like queen takes b5 and then knight to c3. Material's equal. Black has the bishop, white doesn't. And the knight on c3 is kind of an annoying piece. So this was all preparation that me and some others contributed to. I don't know if c4 is really the end-all, be-all. I think that after c4 takes in here, maybe there's some other possibilities. I'm not exactly sure, but it looks like black is getting the counterplay that I would want if I had just played a novelty, which Caruana did, to eliminate the light square bishop. So go figure. He doesn't do that. Instead, he plays the slower a6. But now, after the move h3 and f4, Aronian's kingside attack starts to take off. It might be noted that if you want to check out the analysis at Chess.com/news, I spend a lot of time going into these games to provide quality stuff for you. Believe it or not, I really do love you. I don't know, it's weird. I haven't even met you, but go ahead, wave to me. You're alone there watching the chess video, but I'm thinking of you. The other move I looked at for a while was a4, which makes sense for Aronian. Why does this actually prevent c4? I'll feed you baby birds. The reason is that now, as the lines open up, and black gets the similar tactic as he did before with the move b5, and this position at the end of the lines will have an open file. So remember, before we had pawns on a2 and a6 blocking the queen side. Here, white has the move rook a4, and I'm pretty sure that pawn on c4 is having his last meal, maybe even with Jesus. You never know, right? So if that ends up happening, then white should be better. And all those things lead me back to thinking, why did Fabiano not go for c4? I'm not sure. But still, a6 was played. Aronian decided that a4 was slower and not what he wanted. He also admitted afterwards that he was kind of having delusions of grandeur and already envisioning checkmating his opponent on the king side, which turns out maybe he had real chances to do. f4, these are moves that are common in the Benoni. You start expanding and you get a big space advantage and you kind of get carried away. You get swept up in the moment The d6 pawn comes with tempo, and you just start imagining that with so many pieces on their best squares and everybody coming to the open fire, how can I not be happy about this, right? And that's kind of where the Benoni gets you, right? It sort of gets you into thinking that you're just going to crush it, and then it gets counterplay on the queen side that eventually exposes your own open king because you overextended. I don't know that that's really the concrete evaluation of what happened here. The game ultimately ended in a draw, as you can see by the result here above me. But we've already looked at the fact that maybe Fabiano should have played c4, maybe Aronian should have played a4. So here's what happened. After knight to b6 and rook to e1, we get the trades I'm already talking about. And once e5 comes, this is actually a very common tactic you can write home to mom and dad about. After f takes c5, you're never intending to take back. You have f5 coming. This move not only keeps the bishop on g7 closed, it officially launches the attack to the king side and makes the e4 square incredibly valuable. Let's see that thing in instant replay. We sack the e-pawn to close the diagonal, and then with f5, we open up the e4 square for a pony and follow that by hopefully using the closed position to launch toward the king side, right? That's what we want. And this is very common in the Benoni. After b5, knight e4, both sides are launching plans worthy of the worst deli meat available, of course, bologna. And at this point, bishop to c1 was maybe the final chance that Aronian really had to show that his initiative was not just craziness and being overexcited about the Benoni space advantage, but actually had some merit. And he said after the game that his original intention was f6, and then h4, just sacrificing both the c4 and the d5 pawn, right? You're thinking, wow, is this really happening? But it is. And lines like this show that after hg, you can't take with the f pawn because f7. White's attack is actually really dangerous. Queen to b3, if queen to d7, queen to g3, we're just sacrificing the bishop because Honey Badger don't care. And now the rook comes up, and all of a sudden, give the computer time to think here, and you'll see what me and Aronian and others have seen now, that the white is just winning on the h-file. It's just over. So I spent more time on it, and it was like, huh? Is f6 really something that was going to be that good? It looks like even with other moves here, like rook a7, suggested in some analysis instead of queen takes d5, after takes on g6, if you really have to take with the f-pawn, white's initiative is still getting out of control after knight to g5. I don't care if you're going to sack the exchange and hope to hold with the king blockading. You are down the exchange, and if white wants winning chances, this is where white should have gone. Again, other moves that could have possibly been played. What about knight takes b2 immediately? Still analyzed takes. H takes is the only move, and after queen takes b2, you can't stop me one way or the other from swinging to the h-file and doing the same rook lift as before. So it's kind of funny, and it makes you wish. I mean, you're not really rooting for either player, but with Aronian really having this attack already been launched and built up, you kind of want to see those blows delivered, right? But he miscalculates something which never became clear in the post-game conference and ended up settling on the move bishop to c1, which in the end we have to kind of give some slightly dubious mark to. After knight takes c4, d6, and takes f5, it should be noted that maybe instead of takes f5, if Caruana had one more chance to now then return the favor and punish Aronian for bishop to c1, it was probably with queen to d7. And after bishop h6, takes f5, takes and takes, you get one of these positions where, you know, black is up material, but his king will be under pressure for the rest of the game, including the critical stage of time pressure as they try to reach move 40. Hard to say who would have won, but black's advantage is definitely there as far as how the computers evaluate it. And I think that accurate moves probably could defend black's position. So when that wasn't played, instead after d6, g takes f5 was played, we got this perpetual. And people were critical of Caruana for just going here and thinking, hey, man, this is your chance, right? Punish Aronian's crazy Benoni and play some other move. But I actually spent some time analyzing it for the last couple hours, actually. I'm a little tired, in case you haven't been able to tell. And I don't know that Caruana really did make the right decision. You know, instead of maybe going back the first time, yeah, queen to b6 was an option, and I looked at knight f6 check, takes, and even if c4 check is played in some sort of natural defensive move, the very nice queen to d1, relocating the queen back to the critical side of the board. Black's king is still coming under fire, and I don't exactly know where the clear improvement is for black if he's not just to take the perpetual. So in the end, we're going to summarize this game as a first-time opening by Fabiano, first time awkward comment by Aronian about him playing his first time opening. Things got a little bit weird. In the end, everybody found their cohesiveness together, and what we learned is that all Benoni's lead to Rome, which is a position where both sides have multiple opportunities to blunder. Nothing like it, right? Let's take a look at Svidler's game now, as he took on, we had Svidler taking on Giri, and an interesting Grunfeld. I stuttered a little bit there because actually Giri was white. So now we're taking a look at Giri's game with Svidler, and we're going to see what Peter Svidler had to say about the opening that he probably understands better than anybody on the planet, that being the Grunfeld defense. Now, as we dive in here, I have to admit, as I said in the analysis, I know very little about the Grunfeld and the anti-Grunfeld. You know, I feel like the Grunfeld and Peter Svidler were meant to be two of my best friends in a previous life or maybe the next life, but not this lifetime, because I don't really know a lot of the theory of these positions. It's one of the openings I've never spent a ton of time diving into, and I enjoy the dynamic aspect of both sides having clear and different goals. Makes it easy to see when one side is kind of outplaying the other and where we can improve upon it, which is good for teaching. But this is all theory. You can check it out. I encourage you to do so. Again, the analysis can be found at chess.com/news and Peter Dawkins' report. But in this position, all the way up to now, with the move knight to e4, we are still in regular territory where the symmetrical structure is not going to stay symmetrical for long. Black plays knight e4 with clear intentions. I want to open up the bishop on g7, and I know I'm going to give you a more solid center, but that center is then going to be targeted by me, and we're going to talk about the instructive moments that follow. It should be noted that the last game of two top-level grandmasters at this level actually happened in Las Vegas over Christmas time, that being the North American Open after queen a5, knight e5. The game between Alex Lenderman and Yevgeny Bareyev went to this position here where still, just as much as this game, I have a hard time saying who's better. At first, I felt like, well, bishop f1 should be okay for white, and maybe white's a tiny bit better still, wouldn't be surprised, but the structure is completely symmetrical. Take a look. No real permanent or concrete weaknesses to speak of, and so neither side in this game, Giri or Svidler, chose to try to improve upon that. Giri immediately playing knight e4, and after knight to d2, we're into some regular stuff. Knight takes c3, bc3, and queen a5, queen c2. Now, in this moment, we have to talk about what are the goals of the position. If you want to pause the video and do something a little bit differently, normally I challenge all of you to pause the video and think about something when there's an obvious tactic, maybe a clear line of execution that either wins or draws in some sort of concrete way. I go there, he goes there type of stuff. But I'm going to challenge you now to think about black's position and maybe try to assess where do you want your pieces? What are the goals? What are the long-term positional weaknesses in white's camp? And how can you best expose them? So, assuming you've now paused your video through my talking and you are ready for the answer, Svidler admitted himself after the game he doesn't know exactly why he didn't play maybe what is the best way, which is to move bishop to e6. Now, if you could make several moves for black, if you did the exercise I challenged you to do, what would they be? Those moves would be rook to c8, queen to a6, both moves further controlling these squares. I'm assuming that white is defending the c3 pawn. And then I'm going to bring my knight from c6, and if I don't get tactics here, my knight is coming to a5. So to get rid of some of the arrows to clarify, we have rook on c-file, knight coming to a5, and complete control over the c4 square. One of the best things you can do in a position is actually ask yourself, if I had 3 or 4 moves to make, what would they be? And again, I'm not inviting you to go to crazy town. I'm not saying you'd say, oh, I take here, take here, take here, and then take here, and I'm up a queen, bishop, and knight. Okay, calm down and come back to earth. That's not the idea. The point is, the exercise is about what is permanently weaken your opponent's position. If you could put your pieces anywhere, where would you put them? Allow your imagination to then open up some doors for you about what might be the proper plans in the position instead of just thinking, let me get my pieces developed and then I'll figure it out later. So that's the point. And not to say what Svidler did was bad, but he said after the game, like, I can't remember why I didn't go for bishop e6 and then rook to c8. And I gave a line here that shows that even if white plays the most aggressive possible attempt to come after the e7 pawn, knight to c6, forking the pawn here and the pawn here seems to be pretty darn good for black, and I actually really like black's position long term. I think white can play e4. We're probably going to get the similar kind of dynamic tactics we had in the game, so we're not sitting here claiming that Giri's going to be much worse with white or anything. But Svidler, if anyone, knows the right lines to choose in the Grunfeld and understand these positions better than anybody. I'm willing to say he might be the strongest chess player ever to play the Grunfeld. I mean, he's just so good at those positions, never seems to lose with it, always gets dynamic winning chances even when he draws. So when he played bishop f5, we assumed it was all the best move, but afterwards when he talked about bishop e6, I thought it was maybe an instructive moment to challenge all of you to think about bishop e6, rook c8, knight c6, queen a6, knight a5. Go for those light squares. Imagine yourself with the best bind possible in someone's position, and this is something that everybody should do at every level. After bishop f5, of course, the queen doesn't want to move to a bad square or give up the c3 pawn, so the move is pretty obvious. We got to challenge that thing with e4. Trade, knight to d7, rook to b1. These are all natural moves, bringing pieces to open lines. Queen to c7 not only guards b7, but prepares the common Grunfeld break. What is that? Well, of course, that's preparing e5. Rook e8 is about to do the same. And after bishop to e3, rook to b8, rook to b4, heading after a weak queenside pawn, now we're already in the critical position where we know e5 needs to happen. And you don't need to tell Svidler twice. He already understands all of that. He plays e5. And what's fun about what happens here is that even though white ends up kind of winning a pawn and black's knight ends up kind of being pinned, it shows the dynamic potential of the Grunfeld where everything I talked about on the C-file, no, it didn't come to light in a positional grind sense where black got all the pieces on those squares I talked about. The C-file pressure is still real, right? It's hitting the C3 pawn, which makes this knight's journey a little bit awkward. Is the knight going to really be able to stay there? But if it doesn't, who's guarding the c3 pawn? Black is really striving to open the bishop, and that's where the critical tension is happening in the position. Again, you can check out more of the analysis at our news reports. I don't need to say chess.com/news anymore because I feel like I might choke and die in my own words if I do, so please don't make me. But after rook to c4, queen a b6, and then a quick repeat, we have to give Giri at least some credit that he didn't take the first opportunity at a draw. Just kidding, Anish, but seriously, are you ever going to win a chess game? We love you, buddy. Okay, after d takes e5, he pretends that he's playing for a win. And knight takes e5, bishop f4, he says, hey, I've got your knight pinned. But guess what? Bishop to d7 followed by bishop c6 shows that the relocation has just as many problems being posed to white as it does for black, as the e5 pin does for black. Now, one of the things to show here is that after the bishop relocates, if, indeed, instead of rook to d4, if white goes for something crazy like knight to d6 immediately, this is a question mark move. The goal is real, okay? The goal is that I can try to take advantage of the pin here and maybe even win some material. But in these lines, after knight to f3 check, letting you sack the queen, as fun as this is, black is actually getting just enough with queen takes c3 because there's just too many pieces hanging here. But I want you to remember these tactics because it's a big reason why, when given the opportunity on the other side, probably Svidler couldn't play for a win either. So after bishop to c6, rook b to d4 was played. And in this position, after rook to e6, we have to note, as I'm talking about these tactics, that what if f5? Well, now, if you're paying attention to the tactics I've already highlighted here on the e-file, you would think, shouldn't f5 be a move? Well, after knight to d6, knight f3 check, in this position, it is enough for white after queen takes f3, which would have been an exclam of Vich right there. After takes, knight takes e8, queen takes c3, it's no longer quite the same. Just one tempo different allows me to take on g7, and even if you take d1, I take, and you can't take on g7. Why? Because your rook is hanging. So after you move, I end up with 3 pieces for the queen. You can do the math yourself if you don't believe me. And probably a very nice checkmate attack as soon as the open lines start getting exposed. So that would have been a fun line if Svidler had blundered into playing for the win. But he knows these positions too well to do it. He plays the solid rook e6, which now guards knight to d6. Again, because this is the kind of the whole point of these tactics we've been talking about. Prepares the move rook b to e8 and asks white exactly what are you going to do against my rook b to e8 now that you don't have knight d6. So you know what Giri said? Well, I didn't take a perpetual before, but I'm going to go ahead and do it now because I don't really see a lot to play for, and I might be criticized again later for another draw, but I think you and I both know I have nothing else achieved out of this opening with white. And they shook hands. Just like that, we had another equal result, and that gets us excited because it's time to move on to MVL's analysis for the game of the day. Let's do that, as that game broke down between Topalov, the tournament bottom feeder, against Karjakin, the tournament top leader. And as we said, everybody, it's time for Maxime Vachier-Lagrave and his exclusive analysis to come to the plate. Maxime, please step away. It's time for me to pawn off your analysis as if it was my own. Just kidding, I already gave you credit. Now, we get another Queen's Indian. Are people going to stop challenging Sergey Karjakin in his home turf, or are they going to keep doing it and expecting the same results? Didn't Einstein say something about the definition of insanity? Your call. Now, we get the same position, of course, that Giri had against Karjakin, but rather than the move knight to e5, where bishop e7 was played, or the move queen to c2, where we saw Hikaru Nakamura play knight b7 with the other color against Karjakin, we see the move rook to b1, an interesting move, a different approach. Of course, it's not as aggressive in the center, and therefore it invites the immediate strike, which is going to lead to hanging pawn positions. Now, what I found fascinating about this position is that as I joined watching the live coverage, your first evaluation when you look at hanging pawns is a couple things. It's like an isolated pawn, just some slight differences. The person playing against the hanging pawns wants pressure. Okay? They want to eliminate the activity of the opponent's minor pieces, the guy with the pawns. Those minor pieces don't seem too active. Okay? They want to look for simplification when and if it is due, and we're going to see that white gets those opportunities. And black wants all the opposite things. Active pieces, no simplification, use the pawns and keep them together. You don't want to separate them because the moment you do, one of them becomes backward or isolated. So you want to keep them together, sort of hitting the lion's back with the whips. But black seems to understand that the depth of this position is that white can't hold any of those things that white currently has. And Karjakin must just know these positions so well that no man should venture into this stuff. After bishop f4, bishop f8, simple moves are played, and Karjakin isn't even afraid to invite exchanges. Bishop to d6, knight a6, he trades one set of minor pieces, and he's going to trade another one soon, just wait. Now, once he gets the queen active lead e5, you still think, okay, well now he's got the typical hanging pawn compensation, right? He's got the open e-file that goes with isolated / hanging pawns. That's what you want with those. He's got pieces more developed, but still, these pawns are really, really under fire. And if I had just a couple moves by white, am I not just coordinating and really bringing the heat? Probably, but I can't quite do it because my knight's hanging. So Topalov had to play rook c2, and now rook d8. And again, even with another set of minor piece trades that happens quickly, and Karjakin breaks the cardinal rule that you don't separate the pawns, it doesn't matter because white can't achieve optimal coordination. After queen to d2, g5, kicking the knight, and h6, this is a full board battle here. It's not a position where someone is just focused on one side of, one flank. The pawn structure is focused on one area of the board. Karjakin is playing the full board here, willing to open up his own king in order to deactivate an opponent's knight, and calling out Topalov's bluff as far as his lack of pressure. He was willing to kick that knight from an optimal post. We get a few exchanges here, and the queens come off the board. This is the kind of thing that normally should spell doom for someone who's had a weaker pawn structure. Now, without the active counterplay of the pieces, I can focus in. But in the transition, what ended up happening was Topalov ends up with just as many weaknesses as black has. That counterplay suggests that black should have a plan to expose the weak squares, just as I have weak pawns and weak squares around it, don't you? You can pause your video to come up with the move that I think is critical, and it's the move that Karjakin came up with that ensured for sure that he was at least going to get a draw here. And that move is knight to g4, exclamaviach, heading into e3, which is an ultimate fork town, the kind of town where dysfunctional families relocate to hide their flaws. And after rook f4, knight e3, rook d2, d4, this IQP is no longer an issue. I'm trading pieces and holding the strongest minor piece on the board. And if you're Karjakin, you just have to be super happy with the tournament so far. As I said, more pieces are exchanged, not only the queens, but now the minors. And with it just comes a huge simplification of the position and an ultimate draw. Now, Yes, this endgame could have been played on a little longer. I was kind of hoping Topalov would. He is, as I said, sort of on the bottom half of the event, Karjakin at the top, but he's probably the only one who can lose this endgame because it's open enough that the rook and bishop will probably achieve optimal coordination at some point, which will outplay the rook and the knight. We've talked about the rook and the knight kind of wanting to maneuver themselves on a specific area of weaknesses, maybe one side of the board. The rook and bishop can really find coordination in the open board. So, not surprising to see the draw. Our game of the day analysis, which had a lot more depth to it than I was able to break down here, of course, offered at Peter's News Report. Check out what MVL had to say. And with it, let's jump over to the standings because I like to see where we're at before we leave you all be. As you can see, we have Sergey Karjakin and Levon Aronian maintaining their 1-2 lead. More than a few people tied for the third through like sixth position. And then you've got Nakamura and Topalov still at the bottom. It's funny to say that only a point and a half separates the number 7 from the number 1 with a whole bunch of rounds to play, but it feels like a huge gap. And that's because not most of these games are not decisive at this level. There's so much preparation and so much high-level calculation, they just don't allow their opponent to flex their muscles in any position. And that's why it's going to be tough. Nakamura needs to strike. You can check out mine and Hess's recaps in Chess Center and talking about the upcoming critical matchups as far as who needs to win in what games in order to make it close. Of course, you can watch all of the coverage here at WorldChess.com. Those are all of the times available regardless of where you live in the world. And that's a quick preview of the round 6 pairings. We have the former world champion against a foe that he's played more than a few times before, Peter Svidler. Topalov and Giri. Aronian Nakamura is going to be a big one because in that game, Aronian holds a better record against Nakamura lifetime and Nakamura's black. So we'll see what happens tomorrow with that. Finally, we have Caruana and Karjakin. If Caruana is going to make a move, he has to start converting on some of these dynamic positions. He's had his chances. He blundered it away against Topalov. Today he had this black side in a Benoni that was just weird, but if you're going to get tactical positions, you want to win those things. If he's got white against Karjakin and he plans to make a move, now's the time. So please, thank you everybody for watching. Please subscribe right now if you're watching this video and you haven't subscribed to Chess.com's YouTube channel, shame on you. And please subscribe to my personal channel, of course, Daniel Rensch. Follow me on Twitter. Follow all the action. Go read the news report and have a wonderful day because that's all you can really control is your own perception of life.